I thought I was the only thing dying on this ranch until I saw what was hidden in my new wife's trunk. I'm a man of the dirt, and I knew my land was a graveyard. My cattle were skin and bone, the wells were dry circles of dust, and the bank was a week away from taking my father's legacy. I brought a mail-order bride here out of pure desperation, thinking a woman's touch might change my luck. But the woman who stepped off that stagecoach didn't look for a kitchen. She looked at the dirt like she was searching for a heartbeat. I caught her in the middle of the night, kneeling by a dry creek bed, pouring a strange silver liquid over maps she swore didn't exist. She wasn't just a bride. She was a woman on the run with a secret that could either turn this dust into an empire or get us both buried under it. You see, I thought I was saving her from a life of poverty, but it turns out she was the only one who knew how to make the earth bleed gold. The dust on the horizon wasn't a rain cloud. It was a stagecoach. Jack stood on his porch, his boots worn through to the skin, watching the dirt swirl over his ribs of the earth cattle. His father had died in the back room of this cabin, and Jack was currently watching the legacy die in the fields. The well was a circle of dry stones. The bank had sent 3 letters, each more aggressive than the last. He had no money, no water, and now he had a wife he'd never met. He didn't need a partner. He needed a miracle. But he had signed the papers in a moment of whiskey-soaked despair, hoping a woman's touch might change his luck. The door of the coach opened, and out stepped Sarah. She didn't look like a farm hand. She wore a heavy, high-collared velvet dress that looked like it cost more than Jack's entire herd. Her hands were gloved, and she clutched a small, locked leather trunk like it was a child. She didn't look at the beautiful sunset. She looked at the cracked earth with a strange, knowing intensity. Jack didn't offer a hug or a romantic greeting. He just took her bag and told her the roof leaked. She didn't complain. She just looked him in the eye and said, "I know how to endure." The first week was a silent war of nerves. Jack worked until his hands bled, trying to dig a deeper well, but he only hit harder rock. Sarah didn't stay inside. She watched him from the fence, her eyes always drifting back to that locked trunk. She cooked meals out of almost nothing, dried beans and grit, but she served them like they were royalty. Jack wanted to hate her for being another mouth to feed, but her silence was comforting. He caught her once, late at night, kneeling by the dry creek bed, tasting the dirt. He thought she was losing her mind. He didn't know she was looking for a heartbeat under the dust. Tension boiled over when the bank agent, a man named Miller, rode onto the porch. He looked at Sarah with a sneer and told Jack he had 30 days before the state took the cattle and the house. Miller kicked a clump of dead grass and laughed, saying the land was poisoned. Jack reached for his gun, but Sarah's hand was suddenly on his arm. Her grip was like iron. She didn't yell. She just told Miller to leave before the sun went down, or he wouldn't like what happened next. Miller laughed all the way to the gate, but Jack saw the way Sarah's eyes turned cold. She wasn't just a bride. She was a woman on the run. That night, the first secret slipped. Jack woke up to find the bed empty. He walked out to the barn and saw Sarah by the lantern light. She had the leather trunk open. Inside weren't jewels or dresses. It was filled with old, yellowed maps and glass vials of different colored sands. She was pouring a strange, silver liquid onto a map of Jack's ranch. He watched from the shadows as she whispered to herself, tracing the lines of the mountains. She wasn't praying. She was calculating. When she heard him move, she slammed the lid shut and hid the key in her bodice. "Why are you here, Sarah?" Jack asked, his voice cracking. He didn't ask who she was, but why she chose a dying ranch. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a deep, jagged scar on the back of her neck, usually hidden by her hair. She told him that she came from a family that found things people thought were lost. She told him that his father hadn't been a failure. He had been standing on top of a secret he didn't have the tools to see. She promised him that if he trusted her for 1 month, the cattle wouldn't just survive. They would be the start of an empire. But she told him he could never, ever let a stranger see what was in that trunk. The hour ends with a terrifying discovery. While Jack is out moving the weak calves, he finds a dead horse at the edge of his property. It isn't his horse. It belongs to a group of men he's seen lurking in town, men who work for a powerful mining syndicate. They aren't interested in cattle. They are following Sarah. Jack realizes he hasn't just brought a wife home. He has brought a target. He looks back at the house and sees Sarah standing in the doorway, the sun setting behind her, looking like a queen of a kingdom that is currently on fire. He realizes he is falling in love with a woman who might get him killed before the first drop of water hits the ground. The hunters arrived at dawn, not with guns drawn, but with a legal notice and a surveyor's chain. They were led by a man named Silas, a man with a smile as sharp as a razor and eyes that didn't blink. He claimed the mineral rights to the valley had been sold years ago by Jack's grandfather. Jack stood on the porch with his Winchester, but Sarah stepped forward. She didn't look scared. She looked bored. She told Silas the documents he held were forgeries because the original survey markers had been moved in the Great Flood of '82. Silas stopped smiling. He looked at Sarah's trunk, then at her face, and Jack realized Silas didn't want the land. He wanted the woman who knew where the gold was buried. After Silas retreated, the heat became a physical weight. The cattle were dropping. Jack found his best bull collapsed near the dry creek, its tongue swollen and blue. He felt a sob rising in his chest. This was the end. Sarah walked out to him, her expensive velvet dress stained with grease and dirt. She didn't offer words of comfort. She handed him a heavy iron rod and pointed to a specific, unremarkable patch of gray shale near the North Ridge. She told him to stop digging for a well and start drilling for a pulse. She explained that the mountain was holding back an ocean, and they just had to give it a doorway. Jack spent 48 hours straight hammering that rod into the earth. His shoulders screamed, and his palms were raw meat. Sarah stayed beside him, pouring oil on the iron and wiping the sweat from his eyes. She told him stories of her father, a man who could hear the earth speak. She confessed she had fled a forced marriage to Silas because he wanted to use her gift to destroy valleys and leave them hollow. Jack realized Sarah wasn't just a mail-order bride. She was a refugee. Every strike of his hammer wasn't just for the cattle anymore. It was to build a fortress for the woman he was beginning to realize he couldn't live without. On the third night, the ground began to hum. It wasn't a loud noise, but a low vibration that made the horses scream in the barn. Jack thought it was an earthquake, but Sarah's face lit up with a terrifying joy. She told him to run for the high ground. A second later, the iron rod shot out of the ground like a spear fired from a cannon. A geyser of freezing, crystal-clear water erupted 20 feet into the air. It wasn't a trickle. It was a roar. The smell of wet stone and life filled the dry air. For the first time in 3 years, the sound of the wind was replaced by the sound of rushing water. The water didn't just stay in a pool. Sarah showed Jack how to use the old, discarded irrigation pipes his father had bought but never used. They worked through the night, diverting the flood into the natural troughs of the land. By morning, the dry creek was a river. The dying cattle staggered toward the bank, their muzzles deep in the life-saving flow. Jack watched them drink and felt a weight lift off his soul that he hadn't even known he was carrying. He turned to Sarah to thank her, but she was looking at the horizon. The water was a miracle, but it was also a signal. The wet earth turned dark, and that dark patch could be seen for miles. The tension shifted from survival to defense. Jack knew that Silas would see the water from the town. In the west, water was more valuable than gold, and a flowing river on a dead ranch would bring every vulture in the territory. Jack began to fortify the house. He moved the remaining hay to create barricades. Sarah didn't hide. She took her father's old maps and began marking the locations of soft spots in the canyon trails, places where a well-placed shove could cause a rock slide. They were no longer a lonely cowboy and a stranger. They were a general and a scout preparing for a siege. The hour ends with a moment of quiet before the storm. Jack and Sarah sat on the porch, watching the moon reflect in the new river. Jack took her hand, her rough, blistered hand, and told her that no matter what Silas brought, this was her home now. Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder and told him the final part of her secret. The water wasn't the only thing the map showed. There was a vein of high-grade copper running directly under the house. They weren't just saved. They were wealthy beyond imagining. But as she spoke, a red flash caught Jack's eye. The barn was on fire. Silas had sent a message. The fire was a distraction. As Jack ran toward the barn to save the horses, 3 men stepped out of the shadows toward the house. They didn't want the cattle. They wanted the trunk and Sarah. Jack heard her scream and turned back, ignoring the flames. He tackled the first man into the mud, the beautiful, thick mud the water had created. It was a brutal, ugly fight. No cinematic punches, just the desperate clawing of men fighting for their lives. Jack used a heavy fence post to drive them back, his face blackened by soot, looking like a demon rising from the earth to protect his own. Sarah wasn't a victim. While Jack fought outside, she used the boiling water from the stove. She defended the kitchen like a fortress, showing a cold streak of iron that Jack hadn't expected. When the men realized this wasn't going to be an easy kidnapping, they retreated into the dark. But the barn was a total loss. Jack managed to get the horses out, but the winter feed was gone. They had water, but now they had no way to feed the herd through the coming frost. Silas was trying to starve them out, knowing that even with water, a rancher without hay is a dead man walking. The next day, the psychological warfare began. Silas set up a camp just outside the property line. He didn't attack. He just sat there, cleaning his rifle and watching. He intercepted the mail. He stopped the supply wagon from the city. Jack and Sarah were trapped on a lush, watery island surrounded by a desert of enemies. The isolation started to grate on Jack's nerves. He wanted to ride out and end it, but Sarah stopped him. She told him that Silas was waiting for him to leave the house unguarded. He doesn't want the land, she whispered. He wants the maps inside my head. The secret deepened when Sarah revealed why Silas was so desperate. It wasn't just about money. Silas was working for a railroad company that needed a path through this specific valley. If Jack and Sarah held the land, the railroad would have to pay millions. If they disappeared, the state would seize the land and sell it to Silas for pennies. Sarah showed Jack a hidden compartment in the trunk. It held a marriage certificate from 5 years ago, her name next to Silas's. She hadn't just fled a job. She had fled a monster who legally owned her. The mail-order bride advertisement had been her only way to find a legal protector. Jack felt a sting of betrayal, but it was quickly replaced by a fierce, protective rage. He looked at the woman who had saved his herd and realized she had chosen him as her shield. He didn't care about the maps or the railroad. He cared about the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching, with a mix of hope and terror. He told her the marriage to Silas didn't mean anything in this valley. Out here, the only law was the one you wrote in the dirt. He spent the night cleaning his father's old Sharps rifle, preparing for the inevitable. The twist of the third hour comes when a third party arrives. A group of local ranchers, men who had previously shunned Jack, rode up to the fence. They had seen the water. They were starving and thirsty, their own herds dying. Silas tried to turn them against Jack, promising them a share of the railroad money if they helped him take the ranch. Jack stood on the porch, Sarah by his side. He had a choice: keep the water for himself and stay safe, or share it and risk letting enemies inside his gates. Jack opened the gates. He told the ranchers they could water their cattle for free, but only if they stood with him against Silas. It was a massive gamble. For a moment, it looked like the ranchers would side with the money. But then, one old man, the leader of the local association, looked at the river and then at Silas's cold, city face. He spat on the ground and turned his horse towards Silas. "We're cattlemen," the old man said, "and you're just a thief." The power dynamic shifted instantly. Silas was no longer the hunter. He was an outsider facing a wall of angry men. Silas didn't go quietly. He knew the law was on his side because of the marriage papers. He returned with a corrupt federal marshal and a warrant for Sarah's arrest, claiming she was a fugitive from her rightful husband. The local ranchers couldn't fight the law. Jack felt the world closing in. As the marshal approached the porch, Sarah did something Jack never expected. She walked out and handed the marshal a different set of papers. They were records from a mental asylum in the East, showing Silas had been committed for violence years ago. Under the law, a man declared insane could not hold a legal marriage or a land title. The marshal hesitated. Silas went purple with rage. He realized his legal trap was broken. He pulled a hidden derringer and fired. He didn't hit Sarah. He hit the oil lantern hanging by the door. The house Jack's father had built with his own hands, went up like a torch. In the chaos, Silas grabbed Sarah and dragged her toward his horse. Jack didn't go for his gun. He went into the fire. He knew the maps were the only thing that could prove the land's value and keep the ranchers on his side. He disappeared into the smoke while the crowd gasped. Inside the burning house, Jack found the trunk. It was heavy and hot to the touch. He could hear the roof groaning. He had a choice: save the trunk or save himself. He threw the trunk through the window into the mud and then collapsed as a beam fell across his legs. Outside, Sarah saw the trunk fly out and knew Jack was still inside. She broke free from Silas with a desperation that gave her unnatural strength, grabbing a rock and striking him across the temple. She didn't run away. She ran into the burning building for Jack. The scene was cinematic and heart-wrenching. Sarah found Jack pinned under the glowing timber. She didn't have the strength to lift it, but she used a lever the way she had taught him to find water. She pushed with everything she had, screaming his name. The roof began to cave in. Outside, the ranchers watched in silence, thinking both were lost. At the last second, Jack and Sarah tumbled out of the side door, covered in ash and soot, just as the house collapsed into a pile of glowing embers. They had lost the house, but they were breathing. Silas, recovered and seeing his plans in ashes, tried to make one last stand. He grabbed the trunk from the mud, thinking he could still win if he had the maps. He tore it open, but the heat of the fire had done something unexpected. The vials of chemicals Sarah used for soil testing had shattered and reacted. As Silas reached in, the contents flared up in a blinding chemical flash. He stumbled back, blinded and screaming, right into the path of the cattle he had tried to starve. The herd, spooked by the fire and the noise, didn't stop. Silas was gone in a cloud of dust and hooves. As the sun rose on a landscape of black ruins and flowing water, Jack and Sarah sat in the mud. The ranchers stood in a circle around them, hats in hands. They didn't see a mail-order bride and a failed cowboy. They saw the king and queen of the valley. The old rancher stepped forward and offered them his own guest house until they could rebuild. But Jack looked at the water, the river that was now wide and strong, and then at Sarah. He realized the secret wasn't the maps or the copper or the water. The final twist of the hour, Sarah admitted that the asylum papers were the real forgeries. She had spent her last night in the city before coming to the ranch forging those documents as a poison pill in case Silas ever found her. She looked at Jack, terrified he would hate her for being a liar. Jack just laughed, a deep, tired laugh. He told her he didn't care if she was the Queen of England or a girl on the run. She had brought life to a dead man's heart. He kissed her, the taste of ash and salt on their lips, as the first rain in 3 years finally began to fall. They don't just build a house, they build a town. With the water and the copper, Jack and Sarah invite the struggling families of the territory to settle on their land. They create a cooperative. The secret of the mail-order bride becomes a legend in the territory, the woman who saw an ocean under a desert. We see the first winter. It's harsh, but for the first time, no one goes hungry. The cattle are fat. Jack and Sarah's relationship moves from trauma-bonded survivors to a deep, slow-burn romance. There is a scene by the fireplace of their new stone house where Jack gives her a ring he fashioned from the first piece of copper they pulled from the ground. It isn't gold, but to Sarah, it's worth more than any jewel in the East. The story concludes with a jump forward in time. An elderly Jack and Sarah are sitting on the same porch, looking out over a valley that is green and thriving. A train whistles in the distance. The railroad came, but it came on their terms, paying for the right-of-way and making the whole community wealthy. Their grandchildren are playing by the river. Sarah still has the leather trunk, but now it's filled with toys and letters. The final emotional beat. Sarah reveals the very last secret. She confesses that when she first saw the advertisement for a mail-order bride, she didn't choose Jack because of the land or the maps. She chose him because, in his letter, he had mentioned he planted a single rose bush for his mother and kept it alive even during the drought. She knew that any man who would waste his last cup of water on a flower was a man who could be trusted with a woman's soul. The camera pans out over the valley, the river sparkling like a silver vein, as the screen fades to black.